Wonderful. So we're seeing our participants coming in right now, right at 11 o'clock here in St. Louis. And we'll give it a few minutes for everybody to be successfully logged on. Maybe 2 minutes or so, right, Matt? Perfect. Still coming in a few. One more minute, maybe. All right. We're ready to start? Yeah. Welcome. Herzlich willkommen in Stuttgart in Deutschland. Welcome to, in Stuttgart, Germany, and here in St. Louis. Welcome to this virtual lecture series on race and racism today. And before we officially start, I would like to take the opportunity and walk everyone to our technical setup today. This lecture series will be recorded, and a link of the recording will be found on our UMSL Global website afterwards. Our Zoom settings for today are as follows. During the presentation, all our guests will remain muted. This means our audience cannot switch on their microphones. Faces visible on your screen will be just the speakers and your own face if you have chosen to switch on your video camera. In other words, guests will not be able to see each other today. Everyone will be able to submit questions at any point of time during this presentation. Please feel free and much invited to share your names and organization in the chat box, which you find on the bottom of your screen right in the middle. And if you submit your names and organizations, this will help us to keep in touch for the following lectures we have in line if you wish to be connected directly. Next to the chat box, also on the bottom, also auf der unteren Menüleiste auf Ihrem Bildschirm, you will find the Q&A button. Please use the Q&A button for submitting your questions. Do not use the chat button for it. As for time, we plan on 25 to 30 minutes of presentation, followed by a question and answer session. We plan to wrap it up around 7:30 Stuttgart time and 12:30 here in St. Louis local time. On behalf of the University of Missouri St. Louis, also called UMSL, that you see on the logo here on my screen, also called UMSL. On behalf of UMSL, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the city of Stuttgart for their generous sponsorship of this lecture series as part of our sister cities anniversary celebrations. 60 years of Stuttgart St. Louis. Wow. I would also like to thank our sister cities committees on both sides of the Atlantic, as much as I would like to acknowledge the support of the German Culture Center here at UMSL at my university, and the Deutsch-Amerikanische Zentrum, the DAZ in Stuttgart. My name is Liane Konstantin. I'm the interim director of the UMSL Global Office here at the University of Missouri St. Louis, which is the international office of our university. Today, I'm also here as the representative of our Stuttgart St. Louis Sister City Board that has been strongly involved in making our 60th anniversary of the city partnerships a year-long event of exchange celebrations. I'm originally from Germany. I've worked for the German government for many years before moving to the United States 8 years ago, and I have been with UMSL for 4 years. We are a public research university, and for our German guests tonight, it might be an important fact to know that the large public research institutions in the United States often see a relatively high percentage of so-called minority students, which is the term used to describe students of color. In this series of our events, you will see how this is relevant and very important to us. Today, I will serve as your moderator and, if at all needed, as your cultural translator for terminology or whatever is needed. This lecture series on race and racism is a result of an invitation of the city of Stuttgart looking to facilitate a transatlantic discussion steered by academic and career experts in this field. Our university has welcomed this opportunity, and we're excited about this lecture series, which intends to provide lots of opportunity for questions, discussions, and intercultural learning. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first presenter to you today, Professor Dr. Matthew Taylor. Dr. Matthew Taylor is the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Missouri St. Louis. He is also an Associate Professor of the Department of Psychological Sciences. He holds a doctorate degree in clinical psychology, and he teaches culturally based courses such as cross-cultural psychology, cross-cultural development, and American culture and minority mental health. His research interests fall under the broad category of minority mental health and multicultural psychology, with specific focus on domestic and international minority experiences with and responses to racism and discrimination, as well as multiracial identity development. A large part of his most recent research has been conducted in South Africa. Professor Taylor invited me also to share a few words on his personal background with our audiences today. He's a second-generation academic. His father was a law professor, and his parents lived in Germany and in other parts of Europe, as well as the Middle East, for many years in the 1960s. Dr. Taylor is adopted, and his biological mother was German-American, his biological father, African-American. He himself identifies as African-American. Growing up adopted by a white family and residing in an Italian-American neighborhood in a large Eastern city informs much of worldview and research agenda. An existential perspective of Black American life in the Trumpian Dystopia is the topic for today's discussion. And with this, Professor Taylor, dear Matt, the virtual stage is yours.
Great, thank you. I intentionally made that topic a tongue twister for you, so you see how good a friend I am. Well, good afternoon, everybody there, and good morning here, stateside. Thank you very much for this opportunity to kick off this lecture series and add to one more element of this wonderful relationship between the two cities. I've never been to Germany. I've heard stories. I believe my parents lived in Heidelberg, so just northwest of Stuttgart, if I remember my positioning properly. They were very excited to hear that I was going to do this talk, and they're going to be even more excited that it's recorded. So this will be fun for them to kind of revisit and flash back to some of those memories here. So I'm going to start the screen share here and just kind of jump right in. So I'm assuming people can see that. Liana, we good? Okay, fantastic. So as you heard, I'm a clinical psychologist, and my area of research is minority mental health, and broadly defined, we focus largely on Black Americans. And just for the sake of kind of definitional standpoints, Black American, African American, the terms I'm going to use simultaneously and interchangeably. I know Black globally means very different things. Black in Australia could be Aboriginal folks. Black can also be South Asians in some locations in Europe. So when I talk about Black Americans, I'm talking about those of us that have specific lineage from generally West Africa and linkages there due to the slave trade and those sorts of things. So that's who I'm really focusing on here. And from an existential perspective, it's a little offshoot within the field of psychology that doesn't get a lot of attention domestically here. Most of, I think, the existential frameworks are really heavily utilized in Europe, though, but we give it a little bit of love here. So we're going to weave those into the talk here. So let's just move right in here. So existential anxiety is the first place we can start with. Everybody, regardless of where you live, Stuttgart, Illinois side in the metro area here, the St. Louis, the neighborhood over from the campus where the chancellor is. I can see the house from my window here. Whoever we are, existential concerns are part of the human condition. And these basically fall into 5 categories: death, identity, isolation, freedom, and meaning. So the point with this, when I love these kind of interconnected mechanisms that really show the connectedness between the human experience, we all grapple with these in some capacity at some point in time, in some shape or form. So death basically just means I am aware that at some point this body will shut down, my existence will cease, people won't see me anymore, and I will be gone. So we can talk about death from a personal standpoint, and something as simple as looking or driving past a graveyard is something that can trigger this existential anxiety linked to death. We've sometimes done this intentionally with some of the work in the lab to trigger existential anxiety linked to death, and then ask people questions about their degree of openness towards folks who are different or others in some capacity. Because well, I'm jumping ahead, I'm going to hold that thought. The other piece I want to talk about here is this cultural death. This is when you hear politicians and groups of people fear immigrants and cultural shifts, cultural changes. You might hear language, they're taking over. And that is a very triggering response that a lot of political entities use, I think with great success, to trigger this notion of cultural death and anxiety among people to get them to vote a certain way. We'll come back to that as well. Identity, who I am, where do I fit in the world? Isolation, there are very few humans that exist by themselves. Most of us depend on others in some capacity. Something as simple as going to the market. Somebody else has put the food on the shelf before we got there. Somebody has grown the food, packaged it, driven the truck or the lorry to get it there, whatever it might be. But this notion of we need connectedness with others, and if we don't feel that we need it, the reality is we are connected with others. So this sort of factors into this. And again, my identity of who I am as an individual is oftentimes going to be linked to a group identity of some sort. So I'm a faculty member in the College of Arts and Science. That's one layer of my identity. I'm also a member of the Department of Psychological Sciences. That's another layer on top of the personal demographic variables we could also talk about. And that fear of isolation and how that triggers existential concerns, that's one of the reasons why historically, back in the day, excommunication from the church was such a big deal, because you would be removed from that community. And that was a place where you were identified with, but also had connectedness. Now, if that's not an option, boy, that was really a frightening and scary endeavor right there. And then freedom, basically free will. I can be who I'd like to be. I had to give a nod to a Heideggerian term of Dasein. My father's a Heideggerian fiend, philosophy guy, so I had to throw that in there for him. But also when you talk about human beings, we are being human at this moment in time. It's probably, I don't know what the time difference is, but early evening in Germany now, late morning here, but we're all being humans in different spaces, but at the same moment in time here. But we're actively being, and freedom really speaks to that in many ways. And the last is meaning. What makes this life meaningful? What helps me to get through on a day-to-day basis and drives me to get up the next morning, essentially. So with existential anxiety, humans create these mechanisms to curb it. If we didn't do this, we'd be paralyzed and we'd have a real problem functioning. So we develop these kind of tricks, if you will, and mechanisms and ways to curb the anxiety. And the first is what we call a cultural worldview. How is it that I look at the world? And I like that term, gaze at the world. It's imagining we have glasses on and I look at the world a certain way. That brings order and shape and alleviates some of this existential anxiety that I might have. So attitudes, values, and beliefs are all part of worldviews. If we've ever talked to someone from a different part of the globe, or even from a different part of the city or a different part of the country, they might have a different worldview that they've used either individually or as a member of the groups that they're a part of to help alleviate some of this anxiety. Another one is going to be religious beliefs. This is one of the, I think, the easiest ways to understand how humans have done this to create a mechanism to deal with existential anxiety. So my fear of death hypothetically is alleviated because I follow these religious rules and I live a good life. That's meaning, that's identity. But then if my religion belief system has an afterlife that's supposed to be fun and frolicking and free-spirited, I have less fear of death because I go to a very fun spot. Probably a Bundesliga soccer game for me. But ultimately, at the end of the life, we go to somewhere special and neat, and that helps us get through and cope with this existential anxiety. Another one of these that we've seen really triggered in the United States, and I think historically in Germany along the way, is this nationalism. So if I firmly believe in the state, I firmly believe in the Constitution of the United States, I'll keep it in terms of my own country here. If I firmly believe in these rules and regulations and hold on to that with this grasp, that essentially helps me to alleviate the existential anxiety. And we've seen this triggered at various points in time, and we'll come back to this as well. This certainly factors in. So what does this do? It creates order. It offers meaning to our lives. It gives shape, it gives structure, but ultimately it creates psychological comfort. So these mechanisms that we utilize, worldview, religious belief, nationalism, these mechanisms really help us feel more comfortable in our very essence of being humans, or humans being alive in a given moment. So when I talk about dystopia, what does that mean? It means bad place, essentially. A community that's undesirable or frightening, or a place where people are dehumanized and often live fearful lives. And I say it's oftentimes viewed as an imaginary sort of location, but I would also question and ask people to consider, some might say that it's not imaginary, it's present day here in the United States. You could almost pick any historical era for minority groups, racial and ethnic minority groups in the United States, and you could argue that at some point, some element of the experience has been undesirable and frightening, and at some point people have been dehumanized. Remember now, Black Americans during the slave era weren't even considered full people. They were considered property, so there's no more dehumanization than that. And again, a fearful life. At any point in time, things could happen to you with few repercussions for those that have done things to you. That's a historical piece, but I think we've also cycled present day to members of the Black community feeling the same way about their day-to-day lives. We'll come back to that. I also want to mention the myth of the founding fathers. I think one of the things that we do oftentimes in the United States, and maybe everywhere else, I can't speak for other countries, but the founding fathers were wealthy white men that were landowners. They formed a country that was a social experiment, sort of, but it was a social experiment that really benefited groups that looked like them. There were no folks of color included in any kind of rules or allowances early on. Women weren't included either, and those that didn't own property were not included. But we have the founding fathers up on a pedestal from a very early age and from a historical standpoint. And I think we need to be more realistic and say that folks were complicated and they're not these magical, wonderful people. I consider them to be white supremacists. They formed a country that benefited them and really nobody else. Now, over time, we've adapted the Constitution or our major governing structure to include people, but there's always been a pushback, and we haven't really firmly established an inclusive element for everybody at this point. We talk a really good game about it, but we still haven't really done what we probably should have done from the very beginning. And also other people will sometimes say, well, the American system is broken. And I would suggest it's actually working exactly as it was set up to do, to benefit wealthy white males and that group pretty much exclusively. Maybe a harsh analysis, but this is what we're talking about today. So when we talk about every time we've had a little bit of incremental change, whether it's after the Civil War and the slaves were freed, and remember the Civil War was not fought to free the slaves, let's just clarify that. Every time there's been incremental change after the Civil War, after Martin Luther King era in the late 60s, there's always been this pushback by a cadre of white Americans that kind of helped to keep us in our place. So we got a little bit of something, and then there was a wall put up, and then in some cases, significant pushback. And this is noted very wonderfully in a book called White Rage by Carol Anderson. And she talks about, from a historical standpoint, a couple steps forward for African Americans and then some pushback by a cadre of white Americans. So this notion of person is political, I think, is one that's really, really important. And somebody says, well, Matt, why do you always talk about politics? Why do you consider politics? And I think the reality is, for anybody who's a member of a historically marginalized group, politics plays an intimate role in people's day-to-day lives. And I think we have to recognize that. And how does that weave itself in to people's phenomenological lived experience? And this is one of the things, this notion of person is political. When President Obama was elected in 2008, there was a lot of talk that we were past our racial animus and stress and tension of yesteryear, and we're kind of entered this era as a post-racial society. Definitely not true. It was a feel-good message that wasn't rooted in the data of the time. It was far from accurate. We've seen since 2008, 12 years ago, this massive uptick, more and more incidences of racially based and ethnically based harassment of non-Christian groups, Muslim harassment. We've seen an online presence of white supremacist and white nationalist groups. Southern Poverty Law Center is a great place to go online to take a look at this. They chart and track these groups. So we've actually seen the election of President Obama, but then simultaneously kind of the pushback and the increase in some of this negative activity. And for a lot of us who've been in this country for going on 50 years now, this is not surprising. There's always been this undercurrent and cadre of our country that has been really uncomfortable transitioning and moving towards a true multicultural democracy. So you'll see just some footage here, some images here. That the hanging in the noose is really symbolic of lynching that took place with African Americans largely after the Civil War. So that has a great deal of very negative symbolism within the context of American culture. I also want to call attention to this installment here is put in front of a church. Okay, so now we have the 8 years of President Obama, and then you have to get ready for the push backwards here. And you could argue we've pushed pretty far back. So who is our current president? In the 70s, he was sued for housing discrimination. There was a large settlement. There was a famous case in the late 80s where 5 Hispanic and African-American young men were accused of sexually assaulting somebody. They were convicted. And during the case, Mr. Trump put out a full-page ad in one of the newspapers in New York calling for the death penalty for these people. Years later, after most had served 7, 10, 12, 13 years, somebody else said they had done it and they were exonerated. And even after that, years later, even after their time in prison, when asked about it, the president said they probably did something wrong, so I'm not going to change my mind. During the election, the first election of President Obama, President Trump was one of the major proponents behind the birther conspiracy that was suggesting that Mr. Obama was not a U.S. citizen, and that was his positionality there. During his campaign, it was really built on racial resentment. He really stoked the fears of white America in terms of if he wasn't elected, these things would happen. He referred to Mexicans as rapists. There was a Muslim American soldier who was killed in battle, and he got into a sparring match with this soldier's parents. He encouraged violence against protesters at his events. It was just a big mess right out of the gate. And many of us who had been following Trump since the 70s knew exactly who he was. We tried to tell people, we predicted this. Hillary Clinton predicted this, and not enough other folks really paid attention. So post-election, what have we seen here? We've seen this slouching backwards into a very regressive area of American history and culture, I think. A lot of Obama-era protections, both for people and for the environment, were stripped away. White supremacists and anti-immigrant attitudes and violence kicked up again. What really happened was kind of a legitimization of these sorts of attitudes because their guy was now running the show in the White House. So we've really taken a massive step backwards in terms of our progress. And this has trickled down from at the governmental level, things that were happening there trickled down to the individual level and people basically acting up and doing all sorts of things that they wouldn't have thought about doing before. So you have a couple pictures from the campaign trail. You can see the folks and the parallels with Trump and other kind of nationalistic frameworks here. And I think the code word for Make America Great Again was to take it back to a time when it really wasn't recognizing the benefit, kind of the beauty and the usefulness of having a multicultural society. You can see the pictures there. There's a nod there too with the swastika that one individual has, and I think that has a lot of us triggered to historical things we've seen in other locations as well that have woven themselves into the American landscape as of late with Trump and his followers. So like I said, we've entered a fairly regressive era in civil rights. And again, many of us have had a pretty healthy skepticism about our country, not enough to leave. And that's one of these very simplistic frameworks that people sometimes say, love it or leave it. You can love a place and not leave it. I love my kids, but when they act up or act in a way that's inappropriate, I'm going to tell them about it and correct that behavior. I'm not going to tell them to just leave, although it's been tempting sometimes, but that wouldn't happen technically. So again, Trump really represents what a section of white America has always thought. As I said before, his election legitimized some of these attitudes and really celebrates them. And these beliefs run counter to the diversity of our society. There's some speculation in 2015, whites will actually be a racial minority in our country. And I think there's actually an existential fear of people when that does occur. His government has done certain things that have put actionable things in place. And then this is the biggest piece of all, and that's why it's highlighted. I think you have a large group of folks that are not perhaps overtly racist, that benefit from those policies, but ultimately don't feel the sting of them, don't feel the need to speak out, don't feel the need to say much of anything about it. So they're very silent and complicit. And this is, I think, a larger group than we thought existed in the United States here. And to me, this is probably the most disturbing here. So what we've seen, though, and again, I'm just trying to set the sociocultural context, the umbrella over which we as Black Americans exist. The picture on the left there is from the 50s during the era when the country was desegregating some of the schools, mostly in the southern part of the country. You have a young woman there who's a high school student attempting to go to school, and then you have grown adults yelling, screaming, and treating her poorly. And then we've revisited some of that behavior during the election cycle and afterwards as well. So when you talk to folks of color, I think what you really do hear about are hate stories and hate scars. So even if they haven't happened directly to us, just recognizing that they've happened to other members of the group that we identify with and feel some connectivity to, this kind of secondary trauma, if you will, that has impact on people. And I don't think a lot of folks recognize that until something's bubbling up, they're not feeling really safe or comfortable here. So to acknowledge and talk about this is really critical. It demystifies it, but also validates the experience. And again, if I've recognized that this is happening around me, this is how I'm responding to it, this is how I'm feeling as a result of that, then I can maybe come up with a plan to counter or maybe even recover from it. I think that's ultimately what we're really trying to do. And I want to make sure it's crystal clear. We're talking about all members of these groups that potentially feel the sting, whether it's someone with a Ph.D. and an adequate amount of resources to exist day to day, or somebody else in maybe lower socioeconomic status, whoever it might be. You're not immune to these sorts of feelings and these sorts of frameworks kind of settling over you, this cloud of unsettledness coming over you. And again, this notion that those hateful things are a thing of the past, things are different now, it's far from the case. We've gone completely in a very different framework. And there's also some speculation if this most recent person that Trump and his group want to put on the Supreme Court goes on to our Supreme Court, that'll be probably one of the most conservative courts since the 1930s in the United States. And if I remember my German history correctly, the 1930s were an interesting and fairly transitional time for some things. And that's not lost on me, that parallel right there. So for mental health professionals, what do we have here? Well, how do we get to the point where hate actually gets exuded and thrown out into the atmosphere? Well, again, we scapegoat people. The talk from the Trump campaign from day one about Muslims, about immigrants has been fairly atrocious, but we scapegoat people, we display intolerance. There's a discriminatory ethos that floats around in terms of how we view people. This all sets the atmosphere, a charge, if you will, for the next step in terms of hate and then action. So action towards people, it can be subtle, it can be legitimized, or it can be blatant racism. Verbal aggression could be violence, harassment, I remember during one of President Obama's early speeches to a joint session of Congress, a white senator stood up and actually yelled, "You lie," in the middle of his speech. It's the first time that the senators ever interrupted a president in my lifetime, at least. And that really set the tone for how things were going to go in terms of the country. I think that I remember that very vividly and very clearly as the turning point for how folks were going to act now. And comportment, collaboration was really pretty much off the table at that point here. So from a mental health standpoint, what do we have here? Well, we can certainly talk about stress. We can talk about anxiety, depression. And again, this will sneak up on people. I might feel okay one day, and then all of a sudden, I just can't put my finger on it. Something's not working for me. Something's a little bit off. I can't put my finger on it. And a lot of folks that we've come in contact with in terms of therapy and these sorts of discussions have finally narrowed down, it's just the atmosphere. Something here has me not feeling 100% my own. Alienation, shame, anger sometimes, intrusive thoughts. Some people just say, I give up. Some people talk about leaving. That's not an option that everybody has, obviously. And the other thing we can then talk about is Monica Williams, who's at the University of Ottawa, talks about race-based traumatic stress injury. And it's not a formal diagnosis, but basically it points to the fact that when these sorts of things happen, this is like a slash or a cut. And it does cause trauma to see one more African-American male shot and killed by the police, or one more African-American woman assaulted by somebody or something like that. And again, just witnessing these sorts of things does cause stress on people. And we know that stress is linked to many of the leading causes of death among African Americans, high blood pressure, heart disease, and those sorts of things. So again, these social determinants of health that we see worldwide are really in full swing and in full bloom, if you will, presently in the United States. Then you add the layer of COVID on top of this. And if you look at who's been disproportionately impacted by COVID in terms of deaths, it's been African-American folks in our country. And ultimately, we can come back full cycle to the zeitgeist is impacting and triggering existential themes. I would almost suggest perhaps on a daily basis for a large number of our community here. So then what does this look like? Well, death, I think, is pretty obvious. We talked about that increase in violence and harassment, not just between citizens, though, but also state sanctioned. So there's attention that we now have on police shootings here in the United States, but also there's been a very disturbing trend where the federal government has sent unmarked troops, if you will, and advocates for the president's game plan into some of our large cities to help curtail and corral protesters. And this is one of the first times I can remember, I wouldn't say secret police, that's a little strong, but sometimes the footage of these folks, there's no identifying markers. They could just be me dressed up in army fatigues or something like that. But again, you have this blurring of the line between citizens and state sanctioned sorts of things. But again, folks, think about this. I was talking with some colleagues who've gone and done marches and protests, and always in the back of their head is, am I going to get killed tonight? So you can see some footage here. That top picture is from one of the protests against Trump. And then another one down there was when a group of white supremacists marched through the streets of Charlotte, and there was a counter protest group. And then one of the folks drove his car through the crowd of counter protesters and actually killed Heather Heyer. And you can see some other people were significantly harmed as well. Identity comes up again, one of our existential themes. Being other is very, very salient these days. How we don't fit the kind of mainstream narrative coming out of the White House and out of the country's mouth these days is something really, really salient. And how do we not internalize that negativity in terms of notion of self? On the flip, you also have a circumstance now, though, where this does produce a great deal of pride for some people. We kind of push back and get strong with this notion of I'm proud, I'm African American, I have my group, my crew, my people, my tribe, if you will. And there's a great deal of pride that has also come about in terms of this. So this hasn't always been negative, although the negativity is probably the easiest thing to see here. Isolation, another one of these existential themes under the umbrella of the current zeitgeist, rejection, spatial and cultural distancing. We're not like those people, the Mexicans over there, we're going to build a wall. All the talk that you've seen come from the president sets the tone for a broader framework that does have the potential to impact people. And then this notion of freedom. Can I move about like I used to? And again, the slave era was a time where people were not safe. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time and the wrong group of people came upon you, you could be snatched, you could be harmed or some sort. And when I watch protesters and counter protesters attacking them, I flash back to this notion of, you know, external forces controlling life. If you talk to about anybody in the Black community, I suspect they would give you some indication that, you know, we're not always in control of our lives. The police and government and these sorts of things have really curtailed and impacted us in a way that's at times negative. This is also one of the biggest things that's a change, I think. Under the Obama administration, the federal government would actually come in and help clean up state and local action. So when Ferguson happened, just behind my back here, so remember Michael Brown was a young African-American teenager that was shot by a white police officer, and the local area didn't really handle it all that effectively, but then the Department of Justice at the federal level came in and kind of cleaned things up and did kind of a clean analysis of it. So local and state will do all sorts of things that could be problematic. The feds would always be a safety net, if you will, to come in to make sure things were happening. Remember, after the Civil War in the United States, in the South, federal troops came in to help with Reconstruction, but also to kind of protect the freed slaves. The minute the federal troops left, lots of local areas and states came up with laws, the Jim Crow laws, to kind of re-subjugate the Black population that was, though, technically free. So when you don't have that federal oversight, state and local entities can do all sorts of things, and we've lost that federal oversight now with this most recent administration. And then meaning, linking up to identity. What does it mean to be Black in the United States now? What does it even mean to be American? These are all very interesting questions that come up. Every time I go to South Africa, it's amazing. That's one of the few places I actually feel fully at home. And even being mixed race, that's a whole different discussion. That's a different talk. That's a follow-up talk. I'll actually come to Stuttgart and give that talk, hopefully. But the reality is there you have this notion where there's like an intermediate racial group there. And it's less about being American and being within a group and having some degree of fit there. It's very, very fascinating. It's very, very fascinating. But this grudging notion of being American is something I think a lot of us do feel because of these things. How do I construct meaning about my group, my nationality, in a country that actively says things that are fairly negative about me and my group, my family, my loved ones, my friends, and large segments of our population? It's really an interesting negotiation right there. So just to wrap up, just a couple things that I always like to tell people to do. I like to give a little bit of a, here's what people can do. So for us, I mean Black Americans. So recognizing the culture that we're in. The culture milieu is such that it is a stressful time, and it's going to get worse in the next month or so before the election, and even afterwards, it's going to get worse, I believe. But just recognize that, recognize and be attuned to our feelings, normal reactions to an abnormal situation. I never thought I'd see federal troops coming in secret garb, arresting people in my lifetime. It really took me to a lot of other countries' histories that I've read about, but never really seen firsthand. So be aware and be attuned to that and how stress does impact mental health, but also health. And we don't have to experience it ourselves. It can be vicariously experienced. So when I see, and I don't watch these videos when they come by, videos of the police shooting and killing people, videos of protesters getting assaulted, I don't watch any of that because I know that's my trigger right there. That puts me in a very bad space. Trauma doesn't define our identity. We can move from a victim stance to a powerful one and really use that hatred to kind of push forward to individual change, family change, and eventually systemic change. And there are multiple ways to do this. Not everybody has to be up until 4 a.m. marching. There are lots of other ways to do this. I've probably taught over 15, 16 years, 3,000 students, maybe more, about these issues. So that's how I always look at my way of being. Social media is a problem. You don't have an escape from this negativity. So I tell people, shut it down. Think outside the box. Try to see some different perspectives to help figure out where you're positioned, but also self-care. Liana asked me earlier, how do I stay so positive and happy all the time? And I really remove myself. I've been asked to do a lot of talks like this about race over the last 3 or 4 years. I've probably only done 4. So I know my limits, and I've said, no, thank you. Let somebody else step in here. Narrowness, I mean about others. There are allies out there. There are people that are willing to help, and we have to make sure we stay open to them. So the allies, this is the juicy part here. This is the group that really needs to be activated to bring about change here. If all the people of color in the United States that can vote in a certain direction, it still wouldn't be enough to get rid of the current administration. So there always has to be a cadre of whites willing to move in a certain direction. We don't determine, we as people of color do not determine elections to a large extent. Again, we tried to tell folks back in 16, actually in 15, the minute Trump declared, we said this man is trouble. He represents the worst of America. He's going to take us backwards. We tried to tell people, and here we are right now. Having people as allies recognize the impact of race for many people. It is a real thing. Race-related could be subtle or biased, or it could be racism, overt and very obvious. Just because there's no kind of overt racism doesn't mean that race doesn't permeate people's experience and their lived experience on a day-to-day basis. And I like this notion of just helping people really recognizing that that's an issue. I don't expect race to be salient for many non-people of color, but recognizing that for many of us, even those of us that are privileged in terms of socioeconomic status, educational attainment and class and those sorts of things, even for those of us, it is still a salient variable. And let's be honest too, and this is the thing that people don't recognize or know about me. I'm actually fairly angry all the time now, and I try not to show it. I know my dean, I don't want to get him mad at me, so I try to curtail my anger there. But the reality is, you have to sit with our anger. A lot of us are angry, and that's okay. And it's not directed at any individual in the day-to-day. It might be directed at individuals, AKA the president, but not necessarily individuals on the day-to-day. Don't personalize it. Let people sit with that anger. And the fact that they've actually shown you some of that anger is a really strong statement of how you're viewed as an ally. I feel safe enough around you to tell you how bloody angry I am about the current state of things. It's actually a gift. Be a partner, not a savior. And then ultimately, this is the challenge for white Americans. What kind of country do you all want? Get your folks together. We didn't do this. We can help fix it, but largely in part, the power rests still with that group in particular. So what do you want to see happen here? So this is an assignment that my daughter is a teacher at a school in Denver and found this for me. And somebody added a predicate here. I'm not even sure the predicate is. I'm in psychology, not English, so apologies to my English colleagues. But you can see, even for the youngest among us, you can see the connectivity and the impact. I have chills just reading this. It's devastating. It's devastating that young people are already thinking this person who's supposed to protect and help me is the one that might potentially kill me. And then we have to end here with a little James Baldwin, always good, but basically saying there's no state of innocence. Open your eyes and let's get it together. Let's figure out where we are at. And again, if you're not directly impacted by this, you run the risk of not being able to see it. So listen to what people are telling you directly, but also listen to what people are telling you indirectly. Okay, I will stop share here. And
thank you.
We are good to go. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have had, allow me before we turn to the Q&A box here, for a little bit of a comment. I see that our Stuttgart team is still muted and will, I guess, remain muted, which is fine. But I wanted to share with you and with the audience here today some of the pre-discussions we had, and I also collected some questions prior to this lecture today from people who couldn't make it and will just be able to watch the recording of this. So I remember the day when Nadia from Scheid, who is here today, asked me about a possibility that UMSL would facilitate as a lecture series like that by any chance. And that came just a few days after the George Floyd case. And I also remember, you know, Matt, that I'm still very much connected to my home country, Germany, to my home country here as well, as you know, but I watch the German news all the time. And I remember in connection with the George Floyd case, our famous moderator, Marietta Slomka on ZDF public television, was tasked with coverage and a summary of this case. And her voice was trembling like mine is right now. And it's the first case, this is a moderator who every German knows, who just struggled around and with a translation of the question race and racism, because we as Germans struggle with translation for that. So that is the biggest thank you that you have, like we're launching this whole series of many events. And I just wanted to toss that out there as feedback. The second feedback I had is I wanted to thank you also for and share with everybody here in this lecture or webinar today. Matt, you have actually opened my eyes when we first started working together with South Africa, and a couple of questions. And I've already been here, as I mentioned, purposely. I've been in the United States for 8 years. I minored in American studies, and I thought I had a concept and a good understanding. The moment I arrived here and I lived here and did not just visit my in-laws or family and friends, I felt somebody took me time travel. And you opened a lot of all the eyes I have and more to go. And I don't want to hijack this lecture series for my personal views here. But the one question I would like to share before we turn to the Q&A box is a fundamental question that every German wants to ask an American, and sometimes they feel shy, is the question about identity. Your entire presentation has been about identity and the challenges to that identity question. So the simple question is, who and how is it decided who you are in this country?
Wow, that's not the softball we talked about right out of the gate here. Let's be honest. That's a great question, though. That's a great question. It's always been, and again, this is just my answer. Obviously, there are lots of ways we could look at this. Within the Black experience, historically, if you had one drop of Black blood, you were Black. The one drop rule, the rule of hypodescent. And that's historically been utilized. And I think that became ingrained in many people's own individual notions of self. And I think for many generations, that was somewhat acceptable in terms of I see myself as Black. Technically, I'm not. One of the things we found with our research, though, is we start to expand this notion of who people are and identity. People like myself can say at times I'm multiracial, and that means something culturally, that triggers something, and people recognize that. We're not quite there yet. When I describe myself as Black, people have a schema for that. They know what that means. And I've identified myself that way. There's no longer as much political or even legal pressure for people to identify a certain way from a racial standpoint. There might be hints and whispers of that if you go into the Native experience with blood quantum and those sorts of things. We're starting to really have these discussions around gender and gender fluidity. I think our structures don't really account for the beautiful blossoming of how people are identifying themselves from a gender standpoint. So our culture is kind of slowly shifting and doesn't keep pace with what individuals are doing. And I think it's this juxtaposition of individuals with culturally based notions of these things. Again, why South Africa is to me one of the very comfortable places. You have the colored and mixed race group there in Cape Town. And that's one of the few places I can honestly say I walked into a room there in Mitchell's Plain, one of the suburbs of Cape Town, and I looked around and everybody looked like me. It wasn't this, I'm kind of like the Black folks, but phenotypically a little different. I'm definitely not white. so there was a sense of belonging. Then everybody starts speaking Afrikaans, and I'm completely lost. But the reality is this interesting juxtaposition between identity of individual and how we're socialized within the family, within the neighborhood, but also these culturally based elements kind of rain down upon us as well. So we try to incorporate all those sorts of things, kind of the social, but also the very individualistic negotiation of self and other and larger communities and cultural frameworks.
But to add to that, but also for our German audiences here today, I know that our American audience might be very well aware of it, but in many situations of your daily life here in the United States, you're still being asked or much invited to disclose your racial identity. What do you think about that? What's your take on that? And also with your explanation you gave to my first question, I think you and we had talked a little bit about the laws and when it changed, and what I think there was a case also that that played a big role in this identity question, that a historical case that I was baffled when you shared that. I was baffled about.
Yeah, so that's the Susie Gilroy Phipps case from I think the 70s, where her great grandmother was African American. On her birth certificate it said colored or Negro, I can't remember, but it was the old school designation, and she sued for it to be changed. She identified as white, didn't realize that she had that Black lineage 6 generations back, and she actually lost the lawsuit in the 70s, I believe it was. And then in 83, it was in Louisiana, one of the southern states here in the US. And in 83, Louisiana finally got rid of the law that said, if you had this amount of African-American blood in you, blah, 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 you were considered to be Black. I don't know. I think some people proudly will state, this is my identity. I think we look at people and use the site system too often. I think we look at folks and say, you're this member of this group, so you've had these experiences, so you must think this way. I think the site system or phenotype takes us down a slippery slope in some ways. It's always interesting as a person who's maybe not recognizable to the average person as African American. African Americans recognize me as African Americans. For whites, it's usually about 30%. People usually think I'm Italian or something like that. So it's interesting how people kind of look and then have some idea of recognition, and then that kind of opens up the door to some further discussion in some cases right there. So that's a good question. It's a good question.
Wow. With this, Matt, if you don't mind, we could actually look at the Q&A box.
Sure.
I still have more questions, but I wanted to, like from the pre-submitted questions, but I'd like to actually turn to the chat box, to the Q&A box.
I have it open. I can just go down them.
Perfect. That would be
okay. Great. And a big shout out to Ruth for the first question. I appreciate that. And again, I know Dr. Eob is not going to throw me a softball, so I'm going to read this carefully. So can everybody see the chat, the Q&A, or is it just me?
Bob, that's
the question.
For you. I can see it, but I'm a...
Okay, well, I'll paraphrase the question. So she says, does increasing racial anxiety among persons of color locally and globally, a little shout out to East Africa, foreshadow the rise of political fascism? How could individuals respond to this dystopian shadow? What would you counsel each and every one of us to do our part in bringing balance to our world? Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're spot on with that analysis there, Ruth. I really do think that it's kind of the canary in the landmine, right? When certain groups that have been historically marginalized start to feel and maybe twitch a little bit and recognize something's afoot, that's a sign of bigger things to come. And those bigger things are usually not very good. And I think you're spot on with this. I even think historically, we've seen other minority groups kind of pick up on rumblings of fascism and related frameworks coming down the road towards them. And I think for me, the pushback is, and I used to worry about statements like this. I think the pushback, though, is the fight back. I think being nice, being coy, being shy, expecting the system to work in our benefit, I don't believe that anymore. I really don't. I think there has to be more people in the streets, more action, more akin to the 60s in the United States. I think if we just sit back and wait for the nice white people to bring about change, I don't think that's going to work. I think we got to really flood the streets and get people out there. We have to engage each other, grab allies, form multicultural, multiracial coalitions, and really push back at the local and state level. And my real fear is not even so much at the national level. I fear the state level more than anything, to be perfectly honest with you. That's a stranglehold of power of white supremacy and related conservative views that's going to be really, really hard to break at the state level. If you look at the southern states in the United States, I'll try to clarify this for our German friends, they traditionally have been the most resistant to change. They've been the most restrictive in terms of voter, the most active in terms of voter suppression for Black Americans, the most conservative in terms of reproductive rights and racially based rights and those sorts of things. And Missouri kind of sticks up as part of that group as well. And again, you have a lot of rural areas that kind of add layers to that, and religion plays a role in that. But what's happening at the state level is almost, I think, more dangerous in many ways, because there really isn't that federal level protection. And even with that, we're impacted by state and local on a day-to-day. And it's that state level piece that really scares me. So I like this idea of a pushback, obviously at the ballot box and other sorts of ways, but a general pushback really locally, I think, is going to be a really powerful step. And hopefully it trickles up a little bit as well. Great question. Great question. So another question from Mr. Smith here. Dubois described double consciousness. Does this concept relate to today's cultural worldview for minorities within the context of Trumpism? Yeah, I think that really does relate. This notion of navigating two spaces and having simultaneous consciousnesses. And I think for me, what we've seen with our research is this really threatens authenticity. And when people feel inauthentic, Kierkegaard would say, when people feel inauthentic, that triggers stress. And we're back to anxiety that's existentially based. And it's a coping mechanism. It can be successful theoretically, but I think it always comes at some point with baggage, if you will. So it's kind of like I keep my head down in a windstorm, walking this way, acting and navigating this white space. My head is down and I'm navigating, and I eventually look up around and I realize I was trying to go here. I ended up over here. I was so focused on the process of navigating this foreign space, I lost my sense of self, and I actually lost my way and ended up somewhere in a very different place. And that's when we see a lot of these African-American professionals in therapy as clients. Great question. Great question. And then, okay, another one. My biggest concern at this time is the administration's denouncing trainings on implicit bias or diversity matters in general, and their statements to the effect that any recognition of systemic racism in this country amounts to unpatriotic hatred of the country. This sort of public miseducation is dangerous. I agree 100%. And I meant that. I meant to mention this, that in terms of the increase in diversity, equity, inclusion sorts of framework to really show a multicultural history of the United States, more and more colleges are starting to do this. And the administration threatened to actually pull federal funding from colleges that utilize these frameworks. The 1619 project was one in particular, that if that got used, there were threats that colleges would lose federal funding. Trump's administration also said that they would recommend, or they're trying to form this 1776 commission, which is, to me, it sounds like traditional history that excludes anybody that's not white or male, but they're calling it kind of a patriotic version of history. It all smells like propaganda to me. It really smells like we made these strides to really be inclusive in how we've taught history. And now you have this 1776 commission and the threat of pulling funding for teaching in a very inclusive history, and talking about the building up of systemic isms, racism in particular, into the institutions of our country. But this pushback, again, with that commission it's I wouldn't say it's laughable, but it's actually scary. But I think we can see it's a thin veneer. You know, we want to teach history the way it was always taught, to the exclusion of people of color, women, LGBT folks, poor folks, folks with disabilities, those sorts of people. So many folks have contributed to our country, and we kind of forget that. And it's ironic too. I think we do need to teach this better. We're a country largely built from immigration. Most of us are the descendants of immigrants, but our country actively hates immigrants now. It's the most cuckoo thing I've ever seen. And it's so hard to explain this to my European and my South African and my African friends, that we have all these negative statements about immigrants, but our country was founded by immigrants. And that's kind of who we are. And all of a sudden, we don't like that, all of us. We don't like non-white immigrants. That's really what the issue is. Okay, super. Okay, great. Responding to the picture you shared of the child's assignment response, I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to support children during this particular time. See, I'm always scared when my folks from education ask me these questions, because I'm definitely not the expert on this, but it's a great question. Obviously, things have to be age appropriate, but again, my idea of age appropriate is very different. I always kept things real and authentic and put things in ways that they could understand when my kids were little. I didn't sugarcoat. I might have polished a little bit just in terms of language. Most times, I'm sure they'd say, Dad used colorful language to explain some of these things. But I really just like to keep things real, keep things accurate, and just explain this is what it feels like. I like to really tap into emotions. What emotions are you feeling? What does this feel like to see this, to hear this? I think even for any kids to see that, it can be stressful. I would normalize their response and say many other people feel stressful. I wouldn't normalize what's triggering that response, because that's abnormal. That's, like I said, that's zany. That's cuckoo. How do I say cuckoo in German? That's not appropriate that these sorts of things are happening to trigger our young people, but their responses are the responses that humans and young people would have. But I also have always tried to be very honest and clear with young people. If you ask me a question, I'm going to give you a response. It'll be age appropriate. There will be a minimum of profanity and other sorts of bad language, but I'm going to explain it in the best way possible, my perspective to you, whether you're 6, 7, or 67. Great question. But I think we're really talking about historically something that is moved us backwards. So it's fairly abnormal for the times. I don't think it's abnormal for our culture, but I think it's abnormal for the times and people's responses of uncomfortableness, stress, anxiety. That's a normal response to an abnormal circumstance, as Ethiopia Jackson talked about. While many Americans seem to be on the same page when it comes to understanding the detrimental effects that Trump has placed on the United States, there seems to be groups of Black Americans still voting, supporting Trump. What would you say to these folks to help them understand what it means for our society and the Black community itself? It's a good question. I probably wouldn't say anything. I think you have a group of folks that's too far gone. And I hate to be pessimistic. And as a psychologist, I should say, all humans have the capacity to change. Yeah, you have to want to change. You have to be open to change. And I see a lot of these folks that are using one aspect of Trump who represents the GOP and what that framework is. So maybe it's someone who's wealthy and likes the tax breaks or whatever it might be. I don't think people are really connecting the dots and moving beyond sense of self. And the whole COVID thing has really shown me a couple things about my own country that I found to be really upsetting. We're selfish, we're individualistic, a cadre of us, not all of us, let's be clear on that. A sizable number of us, though, have not really taken care to look out for each other. And I think if you boil this down to any of the communities we talk about, whether it's the Black community, Latino, whatever it might be, I think you still have people like that in all these communities. So the folks that are supporting Trump, I don't understand the cognitive dissonance between I'm African American, I'm supporting Trump and the Republicans, the GOP, the more conservative political party here that historically has been fairly anti-immigrant, fairly anti-persons of color. People justify in their head some way to be comfortable with that. And, I only have so much energy, and I'd rather put my energy towards people who are actually willing to have a conversation and can listen to logic and reason. And I think a lot of the folks that are too far gone over there, you're not going to be able to really get through to them. And I do think it's a waste of time, to be really honest. And maybe that's not a feel-good answer, but I like to spend my time and energy on people who I think are valuing me spending time and energy on them. And I think you have groups of people that are not going to sway or change their mind from that. I think there's still a sizable group that could be swayed. Now, the other frightening thing for me, though, and again, COVID's also revealed this, that our public health system is in shambles. Our health system is awful. I was doing some research. Germany's public health system has been around since the 1700s or something like that. It's been, hello. I mean, it's pretty obvious what works, to me at least. But ultimately, how do people access these services? How do people tap into some of these sorts of things? And I think we've really shown that we don't have the capacity to do this, nor do we maybe even care that certain people are not accessing certain sorts of things, certain elements of our society. And to me, this is one more thing that COVID has kind of shown us in terms of these things. And also the anti-science piece. You know, we used to be a world leader in science. Theoretically, I guess we still are. But the growing number of folks that poo-poo science and say it's fake and all this, if you're going to tell me that 10 studies have found masks to be somewhat effective in the transmission of this, and you're still not buying it, I don't know what else to do but just stay away from you and keep my family away from you, and cross the street when I see you coming at me spewing COVID nasties and with no mask on. I don't know what else to do. If you're not going to believe the science, you know, our leading COVID person, Dr. Fauci, is getting death threats, for God's sakes. He's a scientist. I mean, this is where we're at here. Maybe I should move to Heidelberg and hang out. I don't know. I probably wouldn't even be allowed in the country now because I'm one of those dirty Americans now. See, we're just in trouble. We're just in trouble here. But if you're not going to believe the science, I don't know what else to tell you. You know, part of me is legitimately throwing my hands up at some of this. Like, I don't know. I don't know. All right, let's see here. How do well-meaning Americans not see the irony in defending the world for democracy, not notice the erosion of democracy in the United States? I love that question. I love it. I love it. A cadre of people are okay with it because the erosion is moving in a direction that they're comfortable with. And I think one of the things that's really been clear for me the last four years under this administration is our basic system of government that we always held in such high standard, I think is fatally flawed. We haven't had a meaningful constitutional amendment in 50 years. And I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where we agree to have another one that actually gets us positioned where everybody actually has equal access and an equal shot at doing something that's interesting here. So you have a cadre of folks that like the direction. You have a minority of people utilizing the system that's slow to change and in some cases almost unchangeable, dictating policy, right? Theoretically, we are a progressive country if you look at national polls and those sorts of things, but historically we don't vote that way. Historically, we really don't have a political party that purely represents firmly and with gusto a progressive framework. One of my good friends, she's always saying, you Democrats are too moderate, and she's right. She's right. But if you don't vote moderate Dem nationally, what are you going to do? And I get yelled at all the time by her for that. And that's fine. It's okay. But you have so many layers and little cracks in what we have here. And, even case in point, that's a great question going back to that. I remember even as a kid in the 80s, when the United States was divesting and critiquing South Africa for apartheid, I'm looking around my community thinking we have the same thing happening here. We just don't call it apartheid. We have the exact same kind of segregation framework here. And in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, if you were Black and went into the wrong neighborhood, you would legitimately get chased out with bats and knives and all sorts of things. And to me, that's apartheid right there. It wasn't the state doing it, but it was certainly, don't come into this neighborhood. I remember riding my bike through one of these neighborhoods, taking a shortcut, and I knew better. I was so stupid. I knew better. And I got run off the road by a carload of people saying, get out of the neighborhood. Bike's on top of me, I'm bleeding, and I somehow get my bike home. But, there's a lot of hypocritical elements here. Again, I think people grab onto the Republicans do all these horrible things, but I'm anti-abortion, so I'm going to ride with this group here. Or I like having less taxes because I'm wealthy. I'm going to ride with them here. And I could care less, and I'm fairly complicit with their racist stances and those sorts of things. Even though I have people of color in my family and coworkers, somehow it just doesn't trigger me enough to think that how I'm supporting this group over here might detrimentally impact people I supposedly care about. Great question. Great question. There are so many variables impacting our divisiveness as a nation, from social media to news sources to our leadership. Do you think the idea of the COVID pandemic making death salient on a daily basis, ooh, this is good already, and that affecting the polarization we are experiencing? I think that's a great point. That's a great point. I think it does do that. When you have this death anxiety triggered, or any of these existential anxieties triggered, what do you do with worldview? You grab onto it more tightly. So we found that when we triggered death anxiety among participants in a few of the studies we did in the lab, they were less open. They were less likely to feel favorably about minority groups or groups that were different than them. They were less likely to recognize racism. So someone says, I'm open, you trigger me from a death standpoint, my worldview comes up, it's a big wall here, I'm less open, because what you're asking me to do, theoretically, is take away this worldview and be flooded with this death anxiety, and then replace it with another worldview that's not my own. So when we look at things differently, it's not as simple as, well, that's it's easy, just Medicare for all, or don't kill Black people at an inordinate rate. But some of that is straightforward. But the attitudes, values, and beliefs, that worldview is really protective here. So when death anxiety is triggered, we really entrench ourselves. And anybody who's been on social media knows that we do the same thing on social media. We really entrench ourselves in our arguments, right? I think most of the psych research suggests that you're very rarely going to change somebody's mind in a discussion on social media. People are going to kind of hunker down. And the reality is most of our social media communities are echo chambers. I think some people say, well, I have people from every background and this and that. I think if we really broke it down, there are probably very few people like that. I don't follow too many conservative people on Twitter. I'll be the first to admit that, because I don't want to see that nonsense. I'm curious, but not enough to care to follow. It's as if politicizing a health crisis is pushing us to defend our worldview in an even stronger way. Yep, spot on. While stating that acknowledging white privilege is anti-American. Yeah. Terror management experiment, making death salient, giving individuals worldview to defend, they should have. Right. Now, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. So in a time where we need to bring about change, the mere nature that we have death anxiety and other sorts of existential anxiety triggered makes this a very, very daunting proposition. Very, very daunting proposition. So let's see what else.
I don't know if we are still having questions in the Q&A box here. If we don't, I have two more for you.
Okay. So, somebody says here. Let's see here. Let me see here. Hold on. I think I hit. Oh, what do you think it will take to create an anti-racist society? I think we need other elder generations to get out of the way first and foremost. And I mean, get out of the way. I'm not gonna say permanently. That's too morbid, but somehow get out of the way. I'm always reminded of every election cycle, you have people in their 60s running for the most prominent offices in our country. And I don't think that really brings about change. I was excited enough to be able to vote for a very progressive candidate locally here who's young, African-American, and super legit, the real deal. I'm excited. I got tingles just thinking about voting for her. I'm excited. I think we need to have different people making these decisions. And it's not just an age thing, but that's a chunk of it right there. I think we just need to do that. I think we see more and more women coming into the mix. I honestly like to just make it illegal for men to run for office and just have all women as leaders. I think that would make perfect sense to me. Of course, you can't do that, obviously. This is pie in the sky, but I think we have a massive problem when a significant number of our electorate who I think just by socialization experiences understands interdependency and how people relate to each other and interconnectedness are removed from positions that would really benefit from that framework. I think that to me makes perfect sense. But I think that's part of it. I think helping people just to recognize the foundation of racism that the country was founded on, and sexism and classism. I think we just call these things out. We call attention to this. Again, I'm the first one to dog the founding fathers and say, you know what, you all just think, I would love to go back in time and say, just think if this document really accounted for everybody right out of the gate. You had women, you had Native American, just think if that, and even slaves at the time, just think if that had applied to everybody right out of the gate initially, boy, that would have been cool. That would have been really something. And what's the first thing that happened in South Africa after apartheid fell? They tore up their constitution, they rewrote it to be much more inclusive. I don't think we're ever going to get to that point in the United States, not in my lifetime. Maybe I'll fly in as a ghost and see that has happened years later. But the reality is, making these things aware, and really we're talking at the institutional level too. And I think helping people to recognize that it might not be overt all the time, but it's still there. You can be privileged and oppressed at the same time. If you're poor and white, you're privileged, but also oppressed. If you're wealthy and black, privileged, but also potentially oppressed in some capacity, and getting people to recognize that. But then when you start to threaten curriculum, you start to threaten what colleges and community colleges and high schools are doing to kind of educate people about these things as you progress towards this anti-racist stance. When you have federal level maneuverings and shenanigans that they're going to curtail that, now it's really problematic. It's almost like you have to form pods, kind of what we're doing now with COVID, right? You form little pods of families to teach some of these things, perhaps. Great question. Okay, what else we got?
So, Matt, you have spent 25 years in the classroom as well, right?
Makes me sound old.
No, sound full of expertise. And we learned earlier, it all hovers around minority mental health and psychology. So my question to you is, for our German audiences here, so maybe if you could give a few insights into what do your classrooms look like, and then with in regard to your today's coverage, do you think your classroom experience and your discussions have changed, and how have they changed over the past 4 years that we have spent under Trump?
So my classrooms have always been pretty multimodal. First of all, I always try to set the tone and recognizing that people self-select these classes for a reason. And I remind folks right out of the gate that you selected this class. I let people know it's going to be an uncomfortable endeavor. And if it's not uncomfortable, I'm not doing my job and you're not doing your job as a student. I think it's kind of like when babies are teething, it's painful, but at the end of the day, it's a beneficial sort of thing. Teeth are fairly useful most of the time, right? So again, I think humans, we shy away from pain, whether it's physical pain or just psychological pain, to try to grow, and discomfort. Maybe it's not pain, but maybe it's discomfort we shy away from. And I let people know right out of the gate, if this class is doing what it's supposed to do, both from my perspective and yours, you're going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. Expect that and grab onto that, be okay with that. We have lots of avenues to talk about that. There's journaling. I've always had excellent TAs. I see Camelia Harb on the call here, and she was a TA for a couple of years for me. So you have people that can help support and aid people in this journey when they get uncomfortable. I think a lot of times people get uncomfortable and then they just bail. And it's like, no, that's the time to dig in and kind of figure some stuff out. And you don't have to agree, but you have to be open and recognize we really just want to capture the lived experience of groups that historically don't get much attention. And we really want to call attention to that and get people to recognize different perspectives. And it goes in different directions. It goes in all the directions, to be perfectly honest with you. We also use a lot of multimedia. We like to bring in everything from tweets, everything from videos, clips from news, clips from movies. The reality is with social media now, there's not even a need to really do much that's not real. So movies are kind of out the window now. You can find enough with social media scenarios, good, bad, ugly, tweets, good, bad, ugly, and kind of deconstruct those in the classroom. And that's really been something that's been very helpful to do. Let's not lie, over the last 4 years, there's been a wealth of material that's come out, most of it on social media. And if you just pulled the president's tweets, you could probably teach a class on that. Side effects of very strong steroids might be the next piece of the class, I don't know. But the reality is you get a sense of where some people in the country are really going with their thought processes and their worldviews based on social media. So again, we can bring those in and have discussions about that. And for me, the big piece has always been starting with, here's what American history is. Here's how the country was founded. Here we are present day. How do those historical themes that were fairly exclusive in terms of who belonged, who was legitimate, who should be here, who was not at the table, how have those historical themes of otherness and othering revealed themselves present day in the experiences of people, and ultimately from a mental health standpoint? So that's what we've always tried to connect. And the big joke is I'm probably more of a frustrated sociologist, because a lot of that class, although it's technically psychological science, you can't study minority people and not include sociology, anthropology, and those sorts of frameworks to really understand that lived experience. So that's how it's always kind of worked. Heavy history, how does history repeat itself, or how is history still involved in the present day happenings here? I'm not sure I answered the whole question. Was there a second part to the question? Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, for me to be muted sometimes, and I can't cut in. And with reference to last night, maybe that function should be more utilized across the nation.
I think we're seeing the usefulness of a mute button. Yeah.
Yes. So you partially already answered the question that was submitted by one of our German university partners in Germany itself, and more as a question to all four speakers that we have throughout the series. Mm-hmm. It's a tough one, but as I said, you already almost answered it. So you spoke about Germany's history of nationalism and our big, black, dark chapter in history that every German should be aware of. And we call it in German die Schuldfrage, basically means the question of fault/responsibility. And oftentimes over the past month, when I talk with our German partners in our Zoom meetings, you would have this question pop up in this context that, well, Germany has done this, and I have like East Asian colleagues who would say, well, the difference between several East Asian countries, in particular, Japan has never said sorry to Korea, and it has left this big wound. Now this shifts to the question, so where is die Schuldfrage, the question of fault and responsibility that the new movement is actually asking for? What do you think, how that should be or could be taken on effectively on behalf of all of us here?
Wow. It's interesting. Excuse me. I remember when South Africa was going through the new regime with Mandela, and the Truth and Reconciliation was taking place. And I remember thinking, wow, that's really amazing. That's really cool that people are able to sit down and talk these things out and take responsibility and have a discussion. And I thought that was a really strong framework. And 5 or 6 trips later there, talking with all sorts of people, there are a number of folks that actually didn't like that framework. The framework was rooted in the church and had a heavy layer of forgiveness. And some people were not happy with that framework because people were removed from responsibility of their actions. And people were not prosecuted, and very little happened. So I'm sitting across from the officer that came in and shot up my entire family, blah, blah, blah. That person goes off scot-free. So I had my understanding of what that framework looked like, and there were some others even more closely with it that liked it, and some that didn't like it. I never considered the didn't like framework to it. This is a challenge. This is a really good question. Collectively, I don't know if Americans are really good at taking responsibility for anything. I don't know if our national psychology is really put together that way. I look at more collectivistic societies that might be more capable of doing this. I don't know if it's the American psyche. I don't know if it's capitalism. I don't know if it's our flawed, narrow two-party system in terms of politics, if it's our very litigious society where we sue at the drop of a hat. It's just a challenge. I don't know if we are really open to really taking that final step to truly be a multicultural society. South Africa has 9 or 10, if it's 9, I can't remember, but multiple official languages. We have one. And Spanish should probably be the second one, maybe Mandarin. But the reality is just proposing that. The pushback is just going to be so wild. I don't know if a lot of us are really invested to making that move. And the kickback, you would always say, well, it's not my fault. I didn't own slaves. I didn't do it. But people are reaping the benefits from that. People are reaping benefits from the way the system was set up. And I think we oftentimes have this discussion in the States as I have to lose something as a man for women to gain something, as opposed to we can all win. But we always frame it in terms of this uber competition. Somebody has to lose something for someone else to win. And again, from a collectivistic standpoint, we're only as strong or as good as the weakest among us. We already do this in our healthcare plans. I don't think we realize this. I'm moderately healthy, I think, but I'm paying for the sickest people in my healthcare plan right now. Hopefully people are okay, but I'm paying for that. And if we're not looking out for those of us that don't have that capacity temporarily, what are we really doing? You know, even with the taxation scheme that we have, right? I pay taxes for public schools in the city of St. Louis. I have no kids in the public schools, but my neighbors do. So I'm more than happy to help their neighbors' kids get to school and get some education. That benefits the entire community. I don't know if we have thought like that. There's a little bit of love like that around the Olympics. We get excited to be American. 9/11 triggered that in a way from a bad scenario. But just unless we're triggered by those sorts of things, I don't know what the motivation is for a subsection of our society to make that adjustment. It's almost like we have this massive individualism and people just operate that way. We have these little factions here without the recognition of, you know, we impact each other. We are interconnected. This notion of interdependency. I don't know. I think starting with, you know, maybe with young people recognizing whatever happens here with me impacts somebody else there, and we're all related in some capacity. And we get to feel goods when it comes to sports. All of a sudden, all these different groups come together. You know, I'm going to cheer for Bayern this weekend. I'm all excited, get all my people together, right? And then we go away and go our separate ways. If we don't have that common linkage to get us together, I'm not sure what we have here. And I also think, and I firmly believe this, and this might not be a real popular opinion though, but you know, this intermingling of church and state that we have so often in the United States. And maybe this isn't popular to say, but the reality is you have religious doctrine dictating people's notion of public policy. And to me, this is a toxic mix that needs to be removed from anything that we do. But as long as you have this merger, boy, that's going to be a problem. For those of us who are not religious, if you're throwing a policy on me that's religious based, we already have an issue. That's a problem. You know, at least Iran is honest with their theocracy. We have kind of a closet theocracy, I think. And until we can kind of disentangle some of these things and look at each other in terms of how can I better this person across from me, where we both benefit and we both can kind of build each other up. And we both can live successful lives, whatever that looks like. We can both live meaningful lives. Goes back to this basic existential, right? We just want to live. Most people just want to live and have some meaning and be okay. But until we set up the system to really help bring that about, we have all these individual mechanizations, we're going to be dead in the water. We're not going to be able to do anything. And getting the system like that is going to be the challenge. And again, I think newer people to do the leadership. Somebody brought in the chat room to start with younger people, start with kids, be anti-racist. I think that's fabulous as well. Push that forward. And it's going to take multiple generations. My fear is with this most recent administration and the appointment of federal judges and all these sorts of things, it's going to take us probably 2 or 3 decades to get rid of this regressive pushback in the country. I firmly believe that. And my father, a law professor, said, we overfocus on the Supreme Court when those progressive plays get pushed up through states and people sue and it gets stopped at the state level. They're going to be regional federal judges that come in that decide on that. And if those are appointed from the conservative standpoint, it's going to be dead in the water there. So I think we've really handicapped ourselves over the last 2 or 3 years in a way it's going to take a while to disentangle and move away from.
Well, this is a great summary, Matt. And all I can say is thank you very much again. And UMSL is so lucky to have you in the place and in the spot where we have you. Before we conclude here today, I wanted to take 30 seconds for announcements. Our next presenter will be Professor Shay Kerkhoff, and she will actually cover the question, race and racism in schools. Her title will be Implicit Bias, Systemic Racism in American Schools. And I think she will also bring in a colleague of hers. The date for that presentation will be October the 16th, same time. So 11 o'clock here in St. Louis and 6 p.m. in Stuttgart. And then the third one will be on the 10th of November. That will be Professor Todd Swanstrom talking about racial and spatial injustice in the St. Louis metropolitan area. And for our German guests here, so spatial injustice, this coverage, I'll say it quickly in German. Es wird eigentlich darüber geredet, wie die Amerikaner ihr Zoning machen und ihre Stadtplanung im Sinne einer Gesellschaftsordnung. And then on the 4th of December, we will bring on our own Dr. Tanisha Stevens, our Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she will talk about her role at the university and how important it is, especially in these times. I think, Matt, you hit on those points a little bit during your discussions already. Again, thank you, everybody, and especially thank you all participants from Stuttgart, from Washington, D.C., and from here in St. Louis. Thank you, everybody, for your interest, and we will make the recording available if you want to pass it on and help spread the words for the upcoming other 3 lectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.